left off yesterday, we spoke about Rashi, the why the names of the Bnei Yisrael mentioned again. So Rashi cited the Midrash that Klal Yisrael are the equivalent of the stars. Just as the Navi says, when Hashem puts out the stars, he puts them out in number and name. When he withdraws them in number and name. So when they first came to Egypt, they were alive. He mentions their names and their number. And now that they passed away, this generation passes away, they're mentioned by name and by number because they have the value of stars. So we explained yesterday where I went off when the buzzer went off, where we had a little bit of a disagreement. Did I have a minute? Didn't I have a minute? By the time we resolved the disagreement, the minute passed. So explained that what is the function of stars? The functions of stars, that the energy which Hashem releases, it undergoes a transformation from one level to another until finally it comes to the terrestrial level and it manifests itself exactly as that energy is meant to manifest itself. The energy which brings about, let's say, inanimate, the density of the inanimate, whatever it is, whatever state it takes on, it's all rooted in that energy. Initially, it was released and was processed versus the many levels of processing. And the stars are the last stage where it goes from the semi-spiritual into the physical. That's what the stars are. Therefore, if you read the stars, if a person's an expert astrologer, when you look at the stars, you're able to see everything that's manifesting itself in existence, if you're able to read the stars. So the stars, if not for the stars, things would never come to reality in terms of they would have manifest themselves and developed. It's the final stage of manifestation to the physicality of the world. The Jewish people were compared to the stars. All the energies that Hashem releases is all dependent on the Jews' behavior. Since we said, Bereshis bara Elokim, God created the world with one objective, for the fulfillment of the Torah, which is only through that is his glory addressed. And the only people that have relevance to that are the Jewish Bnei Yisrael. Therefore, all the energies, how they manifest themselves, what level of intensity, and the actually application of those energies, it's all dependent on the Jewish people. So we are the ones who determine how things happen and how the world functions. Although we may not understand why it's that way, but that's the reality. Therefore, we are compared to the stars, as the stars are the crucial and key component for that transformation into the reality of existence. Identically, we, the Jewish people, have that same function. That's the understanding. We're just going to skip to Pasuk K. V'hi kol nefesh yotze yerech Yaakov, shivim nefesh. And all the people, those who were the expression of the Yaakov's thigh, meaning his loins, were 70 people. Yosef is included in the 70, but he was in Egypt, him and his 2 sons. Rashi, Yosef hoy b'Mitzrayim, haluhu bonav hoy b'chlal shivim ma bo lamdenu. What is this coming to teach us? We know he was the viceroy. The Torah tells me he was in Egypt. Of course, the whole story is Yaakov only went to Egypt because Yosef was in Egypt. What the Torah is coming to inform us, the devoutness of Yosef, Shuhu Yosef Haroes Sonoviv. Yosef was as a young boy, was the shepherd of his father's sheep. who Yosef Shoy b'Mitzrayim. He was Yosef who initially was a slave in Egypt, v'nase melech, and he became the equivalent of the king of Egypt. He was the most powerful person in Egypt, v'omi b'tzitko, and he was able to retain his righteous, devout status, despite all his involvements and all that he was exposed to. Omi b'tzitko, that's Yosef Hoy b'Mitzrayim. Just to bring it to another level, I pointed out that when Yosef revealed himself to his brothers, he said, I am Yosef, who you sold me to Egypt. They knew immediately. When he revealed the fact that he knew that Yosef was sold to Egypt, they knew this has to be Yosef, because initially we had said they had made a ban, a level of excommunication that fact cannot be divulged to anyone. And Hashem was part of that group. It was included in that. So the only way Yosef is able to know that Yosef was sold to Egypt, he must be Yosef. But then afterwards, Yosef says to his brothers, Gushu no Eli, come close to me. So if you remember, Rashi says he showed him the circumcision. He showed him the circumcision. What did that mean? That not only am I Yosef as the person, but you'd say over all these years, as the physical being, I'm the same Yosef. But I'm no longer the same Yosef in terms of what I value. My devoutness is no longer there. And if that's the case, it's a problem. Because the only value of Yosef being alive to his father, to their father, is only if he's the same Yosef. Because what was the function, what was the value of Yosef? Yosef was meant to be the one to prepare for the exile. And that's what we originally had said. Yisrael of Yosef, because Banav ki ben Zekunim lo. Yisrael loved Yosef more than his other sons because he was ben Zekunim. And we said, Rashi cited three interpretations of Zekunim. Either all the Torah he studied in Shem Ve'ever, he communicated that Torah only to Yosef, or he was the wisest of his sons, or he looked exactly, his facial features were identical to Yaakov. That's why he loved him more than. So we said, what was the basis for Yaakov's love? Because Yaakov understood Yosef was the equivalent, he was his successor, and not only was his successor, only he could prepare for the exile properly, to guarantee that ultimately, after the bondage, the Jews are leaving to receive the Torah at Sinai. Only Yosef. What happens if Yosef was acculturated and Yosef somehow, his level of spirituality regressed, was no longer the same? It's a problem. And the same thing to his brothers. So he says, Kshu Eli, come close to me. And he showed him he was circumcised. What does the circumcision we mentioned many times represent? That circumcision means I have no relevance to what this foreskin initially meant. I'm still detached from the evil of the Eitz Hadas, the tree of knowledge. I have that level of purity. When the brothers came to Yaakov and said, "Oh, Yosef Chai, Yosef is still alive," when does it say the Shechina, the divine presence, came back to him? Vatchi Ruach Yaakov, he became alive again. The spirit came back when he saw the agolos. He saw the wagons. Why the wagons? Because the last thing Yaakov had studied with Yosef was the Eglah Rufa. So the agolos, wagons, alludes to the Eglah Rufa, the law of the decapitated calf. That's last. Now, we find when Yaakov finally comes to Egypt and he sees Yosef, he says, I must see him. Now that Yosef is alive, I must go see him. He sees Yosef. Yosef falls on his father's shoulder and cries. Yaakov is not crying. Why isn't Yaakov crying? So Rashi cites the Chazal, the Midrash, he would say Kriya Shema. When Yaakov saw Yosef's face, and he said to him, when he blessed Menashe and Ephraim, he says, I never considered that I'd ever see your face again. He doesn't say, I never considered I would ever see you again. What does the face of Yosef represent? The face of Yosef represents exactly what Yaakov was all about, meaning that there was no diminishment in you. Therefore, and not only that, and because of that, your sons are Ephraim and Menashe, who are the equivalent of Reuven and Shimon. That's what it's all about. And that's the reason why Yaakov said the Shema, because Yosef is Yosef, and he's going to prepare properly for the exile, which ultimately will allow us to leave after so many years to become the chosen people. Therefore, Yaakov is ecstatic. Yaakov has that level of joy. The Yosef ben Tzroim. What does he say? What is the Torah telling us here? We know he's in Egypt. That despite the fact that he was a king and he was involved and exposed to many things which normally would have actually diminished him spiritually, he's Yosef HaTzadik. Meaning he's there exactly for the purpose why he's meant to be there. That he prepared appropriately and sufficiently for the exile. And now we're beginning to speak about the bondage, which is about to take place. And as a result of that, since things were in place as they were, therefore, ultimately, there was the Gula, the redemption to bring us to Sinai. That's what Rashi's saying. He's Yosef HaTzadik. Despite the fact that he's a king, he's still Yosef HaTzadik. Pasuk Vav. V'yomes Yosef chol echov. Yosef and all his brothers passed away, v'chol adorahu, and that whole generation. Uvnei Yisrael, Paru, they were fruitful, vayishirtu. They proliferated like rodents. Vayirbu, and they increased in number, vayatzmu, b'mod. And they intensified very, very much. And the land was filled with them. Rashi, the famous Rashi, Vayishritzu, it's a Chazal, it's the Medrash, Shoyoldos Shisha B'keres Echad, that every birth was 6 in one litter. So the Malbim explains, normally when you have sextuplets, all the children are not necessarily healthy. You have some stronger, some weaker. Some children don't even survive the birth. Vayatzmu, from the word otzum, they were powerful. Each child was of the 6 was born like a single birth. That's the way the Malbim explains. Despite there was sextuplets, nevertheless they were all born healthy. And not others learned. Vayatz means, normally in groups you have leaders and you have followers. You have a more aggressive personality, you have more laid-back personality. Vayatzu, each one of them was a personality. Each one had an independence. Each one had an identity unto himself. Could you imagine? We used to say years ago when Golda Meir was Prime Minister of Israel, and I'm not sure who the president was then. I think it was maybe Eisenhower, or one soon after that. So the conversation was that he rules over a nation of 200 million people. He says, in Israel, we have so many people, but they're not just ordinary people. Each one is a general. Every Jew has what to say. Each one's a personality. In the United States, it's not the same. You dictate to them, they follow. In Israel, it's not so simple to be people follow. Everybody has his own twist, his own approach, how things should be. Vayatzmu, each one had an independent identity. Okay, so here there's a famous Sifarno. Usually a rodent, comparing something to a rodent, it's not a very appropriate comparison. We discussed this. Yaakov, the Torah says, "Your children will be like the dust of the earth." So the Midrash addresses it. You say it'll be like the sand on the beaches is one thing, but dust is something which has no value whatsoever. It's worthless. So we explained the Medrash addresses that. Just as dust, if you don't add water to it, when the wind comes, it scatters it. So by adding water, it gives it substance, and it cannot be scattered. So same thing, Torah is compared to water. So if the Jewish people are intermingled with Torah, that gives them permanence. Otherwise, they're scattered. That was the Midrash. Vayishritzu. If you take a look over here in the Sifarno, if you have it, Acha shemesu kol shivim nefesh. After the 70 individuals passed away, they were the influence for the generation. Notu ledarkei shrotzim. They veered to behave like rodents. This is when they abandoned their Judaism. They abandoned their whole persona of spirituality. And the Midrash says even more specifically, when the generation passed away, they said, we don't want to circumcise ourselves any longer. We want to be like the Egyptians. The circumcision, Mila, we said that was the crucial transformation from pre-sin to post-sin, or post-sin to pre-sin. When we were given the mitzvah Mila, and now the Jews say, we don't want to be circumcised, we want to be like the Egyptians. As a result of that, it's Vayishrutzu. They behaved like shrutzim, like rodents. It is something which is very pejorative, because that's exactly what they did. That's the Sefarno. So over here, the Sefarno says something phenomenal. We find that the only tribe that was not enslaved was the tribe of Levi. Every other Shevet was part of the bondage. And the reason why the Chazal tell us, why was Levi the smallest tribe of all the tribes? Because it tells us over here that only the tribes, the whole concept of the bondage was to minimize and to weaken us and to wear us down, that we should not be able to proliferate. Hashem says, you think you're going to minimize my children, not allowing them to proliferate because you're going to actually tax their systems physically, just to the contrary. The more you enslave them, the more they're going to increase in numbers. So since Levi was not part of the bondage, therefore Levi, when the children were born, they were normal births. It was not continuously 6 in each litter. Therefore, Levi was the smallest tribe. Factually, Levi was not part of the bondage. Why was Levi not part of the bondage? That's the question. Levi was never idolaters in Egypt. All the other Jewish people, the other tribes, they became idolaters. They assumed the Egyptian belief because they had the masters. Being under the dominance of the master was an idolater. The subjects, which are chattels, they assumed those beliefs. Levi was never a slave. They retained their belief that was part of their tradition. Well, why was Levi not influenced? Why did Levi not agree to become slaves? We'll discuss. So the Sefarno says, which of Yaakov's sons was the last one to pass away? Levi. Levi was the last one to pass away. As a result of that, Levi's children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren were under his influence. So because they were under his influence more than the other ones, because the other ones passed away earlier, the other ones abandoned their Judaism because they didn't have that role model of the founder of their tribe. Therefore, they went south. But Levi, who was the last one and lived the longest, he watched over his children like a hawk and all his descendants. Therefore, they retained their identity as Jews, not only their identity as Jews, but even the belief. And therefore, they were never enslaved. So you take a look in Sefarno. Not exactly here. 1 second. So the Midrash says, but if they enslaved us, why did they enslave Levi? It wasn't done just, if you read about, that book, that was written by Goldhagen, about Hitler's willing executioners. He writes, it was a whole process how he did it. The final solution wasn't implemented overtly that it was obvious. It was done very subtly, very subtly. First they trained and they conditioned this machine of genocide. They had people in the mental institutions, and they had these people, taking these people, putting them to death, even non-Jews, torturing them. They conditioned them to become inhuman. But they started with people that were mentally ill, infirm, handicapped. That's where they started. And eventually, they instituted the Nuremberg laws, and the Jews were impoverished, and they depicted them as parasites, and they compared them to rodents. It was a gradual process. And then afterwards, they sent them to labor camps, but actually they were not. And gradually, eventually, the Jew wasn't seen as a human being any longer, and people had no problem seeing the Jew as subhuman, as a burden, as a threat to the whole society. Therefore, they annihilated him. It was a whole process. It was a psychological process. Paro could not institute the bondage overtly. Couldn't do it immediately. Here, there's the family of Yosef. A human being has a conscience. How can we take these people and turn them into slaves? So it was gradual. What did he do? As it says, they worked the Jews beperach. What's perach? Perach in reality means it was work that literally broke them. They actually pulverized them. They became brittle due to the overwhelming physical labor and malnutrition, what they did to them. Because the whole idea was, if you minimize them physically, they can't procreate. But it was to the contrary. The more they minimized them physically, the more they procreated. So originally he put out the word, which of the Jews I want, and Paro took off his regal garments, and he was involved in mortar and brick. He says, I'm building, we have to rebuild the country. Who wants to participate with me? The Jews were very capable. As Yosef initially, when his brothers came, he said to his brothers, just tell Paro that you're shepherds, not only yourself, but your forefathers. Do not show Paro your capability. Because the moment he sees how capable you are, he's going to conscript you into his army. You don't want that. Let him believe that you're weaklings, that you're limited, and you have tremendous limitation. Paro says, understood, because Bilam was his advisor, participate with me in rebuilding the country. And as Jews are very dedicated and appreciative, they all agreed and they joined the forces. Amram, Moshe's father, was the leading Torah sage of the generation. He advised them, do not allow yourself to be conscripted. Why? Because the moment Paro sees your capability, it's over. Once you sign up to join, it's forever. The only tribe that listened to Amram was Levi, because Amram was Levi, was the tribe of Levi. Because they listened, they were never conscripted. Once they weren't conscripted, as a result of that, they were not part of the bondage for that reason. But the reason why they listened, it's only because Levi was the last son of Yaakov to pass away. He had that level of influence, and they valued what they represented. The others that the founding fathers, that influence wasn't there, they were acculturated a little bit. They were actually diminished due to the environment. Therefore, they said, we're giving up circumcision. God says, the moment you give up circumcision, I'm throwing you to the dogs. The bondage will be instituted immediately. Levi, even in Egypt, had themselves circumcised. Levi was always circumcised. The rest of the tribes were not circumcised in Egypt. The first Sephardim, what says, so these are the names of the Israel. He writes, the people mentioned here, it's important they should be acknowledged by name, because we always speak, what is the significance of a name? Each of the names that each of the Shvatim had, it identified their persona and their presence as that exceptional person. And during the years of their lives, they were luminaries. Each one was a luminary. And that's why the nation, the people did not go and abandon their beliefs, because each one was a luminary. They represented what they were all about, and therefore they didn't deviate. Omnam achri mosam However, after this generation passed away, the children were tzaddikim, but they were not at that level, and they were valued not by God and not by people any longer. They were no longer those luminaries, and therefore the Jews chose to leave it, to abandon whatever they were all about. That's why they're identified by names. You know, it's interesting. Or Shiv Zichron Baruch always used to mention a Kuzari, that the Kuzari writes that there's a classification of people called Amoritz. Amoritz means unlearned people, but it was more than that. They took on a position which was not exactly in sync with the Torah. They had their own interpretations. They were very lax in the observance of mitzvos. But the Kuzari writes that the Amoritz who saw a Novi, who saw a prophet, not only can't we fathom what a prophet was, we can't even fathom the personality of an Amoritz who saw a prophet. Meaning the prophet was something not to be believed. Someone God communicated with that person. He had a certain degree of presence. The Amoritz who was exposed to that presence, we can't even fathom who he was. So we're talking about the sons of Yaakov. These are the founding fathers of each of the tribes. What level of luminary are they? As long as they lived, when we say luminary, as the sun brings light to existence, they were luminaries. They represented in such an overwhelming, positive, valuable status, the Jews did not even consider valuing whatever that Egyptian culture was. But the moment they passed away, where that representation was not so absolute, it was a little gray, it took on a gray look, people already, it wasn't this clear any longer. They became attracted to other things. Once they became attracted to other things, eventually they abandoned it altogether, not even circumcised.